So good morning and welcome. I want to thank you all for coming and listening to this presentation on some of the magical works of Mark Catesby. My name is Ethan Freed. I work for the Bahamas National Trust, which runs the native national park system of the Bahamas, primarily stationed at the Leon Levy Native Plant Preserve. The Levy Preserve focuses on the native plants of the Bahamas. I certainly hope you all get a chance to come visit us one day. I want to thank our hosts, Santiago, the Cartagena Botanic Garden, as well as Botanic Gardens Conservation International, for organizing and running this wonderful meeting of gardens from around the region. It is quite heartening to look out and see so many old friends here, but even more heartening to see what I think are going to be so many new ones. This was a big push in the outcome from the Botanical Bridges Congress in 2022 was to expand our network out, and it seems we've started to really get to that process. So I'm relatively new to the works of Mark Catesby, having only gotten involved in the last few years on his works, and there are many others that have come before me to write extensively on his works, and I really relied upon those works to interpret his studies. But we could really fill an entire symposium just dedicated to Mark Catesby. I'm going to focus today primarily on a little bit on his biography, but primarily on his works of the Bahamas. So, why even talk about Mark Catesby? He was doing work 300 years ago, and there's still a lot of information in his works that's relevant today. It's certainly he was one of the first to start pairing organisms together ecologically, having birds on plants that they were either distributing their fruit or pollinating or things like that. It's certainly also an insight into a world of the Bahamas of a time period in which we have no other records whatsoever at all of what was going on. He also included a number of organisms that are of conservation interest to us today. You see over here, this is the ivory-billed woodpecker, which he was able to observe now as a completely extinct animal. Another one is the Bahamian Utia here, which is a critically endangered species, and we can learn information from his writings to what we can apply today. His work was also important in terms of botanical garden creations, in that he was bringing back a lot of specimens and species that are now incorporated in gardens around the world. His work was very much of the times. He was part of the British Empire that were sending naturalists out and going to see what was in their colonies that they could extract, exploit, and use. And it's very much what we call ethnography or ethnobotany or economic botany. And he was describing how people were using these organisms in different ways. This is a classic example from his works, a pairing of a white-crowned pigeon with some Chrysobalanus acaco. Both he describes as food items and tasty, and he would pair things together that you could eat. At other times, you see examples like this. This is white-cheeked pintail, which is certainly a food crop, but pairing it with a plant, Beritia arborescens, which has no food value at all, but likely incorporated because it's valued in horticulture. So what was his works? So he produced a series of plates in total that started coming out between 1731 and 1743, with an additional appendix that came out in 1747 with 20 additional plates. The first volume has the most text in it, talking about the Carolinas and Bahamas and what was going on there. And then the second volume really was just more plates and descriptions of those species. And really, Mark Catesby's work was it. It was the document that people would go to for almost 100 years. If you wanted to talk about the flora and fauna of the Western Hemisphere, Mark Catesby was the document you went to. If you look at it, you were able to see specimens as they were rather than a pressed specimen or a dried or preserved animal or things like that, and people would reference it. So within it, there are 410 organisms that can be identified taxonomically, 246 from the Carolinas and Florida, 124 from the Bahamas, number 7 from Jamaica, and then there are 13 sort of miscellaneous species that he talks about where we don't have a locality in which he was really observing them. In addition to all the organisms, he produced a lot of works about insects. And I bring this particular image up to note. This one in particular, this is what is known as a chigger or a shigose. This is a semi-parasitic organism, and he talks about it being able to extract them from the feet of the second royal governor in Nassau. But I bring this up because he talks about being able to observe them using a microscope. So this is something we know he likely didn't get in the Bahamas, but he was traveling around with it, had his own. And Catesby was an influencer, certainly for his time. We look at people who cite his work. Thomas Jefferson, one of the founders of the United States, talked about his work as the most reliable and complete illustration of the New World and relied upon it. People like Lewis and Clark, when they were again preparing for their expedition west in the United States, were using it as a reference source of what organisms they might come in contact with. And then we also see John Audubon, who's using his works and applying the techniques that Catesby was developing in terms of how he did his drawings and illustrations. But probably most of note is Carl Linnaeus. Carl Linnaeus was a contemporary of Mark Catesby. We know that they were in England together at least once in 1736, but there's only one known letter out there of correspondence between the two, and he was writing to Linnaeus about the specimens he was sending to Uppsala. Within Linnaeus's work, there are at least 131 references to work of Mark Catesby, including 17 species that were described entirely from Catesby's work. Another 114 that are nomenclatural or just citations for those species. But that being said, Linnaeus was not a fan of Mark Catesby. We know he had access to Catesby's work, but we know he did never own a set of his publication. And he even had a graduate student publish as part of his dissertation, sort of talking against the work of Mark Catesby and talking to 5 others because of the plates that he put in. So he had these hand-carved copper plates and beautiful prints that were produced from it, but it made them incredibly expensive. And so very few people could afford them or access them. And so when Linnaeus did his work, he purposely did not include any etchings or drawings or anything because of how expensive it made the publication and limited its accessibility. So for a person who had sort of a seminal influence in the development of natural history, very little is known of his early childhood. We know he was born in Castle Hedingham in 1682, 1683 time period, but almost no real knowledge of his early years. Now, what we do know is that he had influences at that time. He was certainly in contact with the naturalist John Ray, who was a zoologist who lived just 6 miles from where Catesby grew up. And he was definitely in contact with Samuel Dale, who was a student and apprentice of John Ray and lived nearby as well. These were the two that were introducing Catesby to horticulture, which was important for him in the work that he did, but also herbarium collection, seed collection, live plant collection, things like that. Both of them had extensive libraries. This is important how he developed. We know within Catesby's own library, he had the works by William Salmon. We know he had a copy of Aesop's Fables, but why would these be important? What was very common at the time is that people would learn how to draw and etch by copying the works of others. So they would go into libraries, have that time sketching and etching and doing those things based on the works that they had, and you learned by copying. So having access to these libraries of John Ray and Samuel Dale is where he was able to really hone his artistry. He was never formally or professionally trained. Mark Catesby first came to the Americas in 1712, staying through 1719. He accompanied his sister Elizabeth as she traveled to Virginia when she had married a gentleman named William Coke. William Coke was a very prominent physician at the time. He was able to give Catesby access through the colonies and introductions to a lot of people. We also know at the time he traveled to the Caribbean in 1714, made trips to Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, Barbados. It was at this time he also was introduced to William Byrd. And it's actually through William Byrd that we know most about what Mark Catesby was doing, that William Byrd left extensive diaries of his time and was the one who introduced him to the plants of the New World. And they traveled around the colonies and like that. But apparently, according to William Byrd, they also did a lot of drinking. It's drinking lots of wine in the evenings after dinner and stuff like that. They remained friends throughout their lives. Upon returning to England in 1719, he brought with him numerous drawings and etchings and seeds and stuff like that. He brought them back and showed them to Samuel Dale, who supported him. And it was through Samuel Dale that he was introduced to William Sherrard. And William Sherrard was a seminal figure for him. He was so impressed with Catesby's work that he was able to get sponsorship through the Royal Society of London to return back to the Americas to continue on this work. And Catesby was able to get sponsorship between £20 per year and a £10 advance to start the work. So in 1722, he returned to the colonies, to the Carolinas, and traveled extensively around them through the river system. And at the time, what people were doing was using primarily dugout canoes, and they would use these to travel up and down. And he spent 3 years just traveling around the colonies, collecting, drawing, and things like that. But I'm not going to talk about his work in the Carolinas. I'm going to talk about his work in the Bahamas. The good stuff, I like to call it. So he arrived in the Bahamas in 1725, 299 years ago. We're going to celebrate his 300th anniversary next year. We know that he spent time into 1726, but we have no records of when he was at any one location. We know he was primarily in Nassau, where he was the guest of the second royal governor, George Denny. In the text, he talks about different things, and one of the things he mentions is this species here, Cassia or Genipa clusifolia, the 7-year apple. And in the text, it's funny because he talks about it flowering for 9 months of the year, and then wonders, why is it called 7-year apple? And this is a common name still in use in the Bahamas today. And I will say, I wondered why it's called 7-year apple as well. It flowers practically year-round, it fruits practically year-round, and it's really only edible if you like to chew on golf balls, kind of thing. Within the text, we know he visited 4 of the northern islands, New Providence, where he stayed at, as well as Abaco, Andros, and Eleuthera, or Elathra, as it was called at the time. Traveling around the islands with a boat called sloops. These are shallow vessels that were easy to travel between the islands. And these boats are still actually in use today in the Bahamas, but really primarily only for what we call racing regattas that occur annually throughout the islands. Now, the Nassau of today is certainly not the Nassau that he described. He talks about the country as having 1,100 people total, including 200 African slaves spread across New Providence, Eleuthera, and an island called Harbor Island. Now, today, this Bahamas is very different. New Providence has almost 300,000 people living on it and an annual visitorship of over 5 million. It's a very different place. Now, keeping in mind, people at that time were living off the land. You had to get your resources. There's no store you could go to get your stuff. And within it, he talks about how easy it was to go after some of the animals that were there. Unfortunately, for ones like the Caribbean monk seal, which extensively harvested for its oil and is now an extinct species, he was talking often about the birds that were so tame that you could literally go up to them and as hunters and pick the babies up and eat them. He describes the juvenile yellow-crowned night pigeon or yellow-crowned night herons as incredibly delicious and tasty. This is Catesby's Caribbean. This is within his works. He describes a lot of the geography of the Bahamas in terms of its relationship to Cuba and Florida and other islands. The map is relatively accurate for something that's 300 years old. Not extensive, but discussions of rainfall occurring in the Bahamas, talks about these violent storms that would come and drop large amounts of water, but then be gone within a short period of time. And here's a good example of a massive storm system over the island of Grand Bahama. Talks about the air quality of the Bahamas, and something that is void of noxious exhalations in the air. And this was most likely a reference to malaria that was certainly rampant throughout the Florida and the Caribbean region. And talked about it was a place that people would come to escape cold at the time. And that's still true today, that millions of visitors that come to the Bahamas for its pleasant temperatures and clean air and clean water and beautiful views. He describes only needing to have a fire lit to keep warm for just a few days in December of 1725. And really, if you go around the Bahamas today, most of the islands, this is what it still looks like. The islands are relatively uninhabited with clean air and clean water. Discussions of the geology, talking about how flat the Bahamas was in comparison to other islands in the Caribbean. He didn't know it at the time, but in fact, the highest point in all of the islands in the Bahamas was only 63 meters, with more than 50% of the country less than 5 meters above sea level. He talks about features that Bahamians now refer to as blue holes. These are essentially vertical shafts that go through the limestone, going down in many cases hundreds of feet. You have fresh water at the surface, and as you go down, it's salt water. And a lot of these are tidally connected. They'll rise and fall with tides throughout the day. He also describes these limestone sinkholes, and he was very clear about how dangerous these were because they would get covered with leaves and branches, and hunters would go out and fall in them and never return. Extensive discussions of tidal salt marshes, and he talked about observing these areas where they were virtually dry, and then as the day progressed, the tide would come in and flood these areas. And this is still true of most of the northern islands in the Bahamas, having extensive tidal salt marshes. A lot of discussion on soil types, and his soil types and system he talks about is still applicable today, and Bahamians still use the term that he coined. He talked about a type of area called blacklands. This corresponds to what we talk about today in the Bahamas as coppice, or broadly Caribbean dry forest. And he describes this as areas that had good fertility, but was depleted quite quickly. And it was terrible for growing sugarcane. He talked about an area called whitelands. This is a variation on Caribbean dry forest, but instead of occurring on a limestone rock, it occurs on limestone sand. This was also good for farming, but with low fertility, really the only good crop to grow there was maize. Lastly, he talks about redlands. These are red soils. They're very clay in nature. They're heavy in iron oxides that come over to the Bahamas and the Caribbean through storms that wash over from the Sahara Desert and drop the sand in the Bahamas and other islands. These are still used for agriculture today, and certainly on the island of Luther, you see extensive pineapple plantations that really use these soils for that type of work. Just a brief discussion of the cave system that occurred there. Didn't really mention much beyond them as them existing, but we do know that people were likely using them for refugia during storms, but also for extraction of backwater, which is heavily prized for fertilizers, especially when you had such poor soils. Farming is still done today. It is still on poor soil. And he discusses this in the context of like, if you were relying upon farming, there's no way that you could survive. You couldn't produce out of it. So people were looking around at what was around the islands is what could they extract as a trade item. And certainly one of the things people were doing was production of salt. The Bahamas has these shallow lakes. And you bring in salt water and it would evaporate out and you collect the salt over time. And that was a trade item important for preserving food and things like that. Today, we still have salt production in the Bahamas. This is a site in the southern island, an island called Great Inagua, and Morton Salt is there. And they produce millions of tons of salt today in the exact same methods that Catesby was describing from 300 years ago, although I will say with a lot more modern equipment. One of the other things that he talks about is walking the beaches in search of ambergris. Ambergris comes from Wales. It's highly prized in the perfume industry. And to describe how people would walk along shorelines after storm systems and look for ambergris that had washed up. This is still done today by Bahamians. This is an example found by one of my staff members just a few years ago, knowing that after storms, we have you go walk the beaches. They found this piece size of the palm of his hand. This is worth thousands of dollars. So what did Catesby have in terms of Bahamian species? There's 124 identifiable organisms from the Bahamas, including 65 plants. The rest of them are things like fish, and snakes, and sea turtles, gorgonians, insects, and things like that. Only a description of one mammal and one iguana. So this is a good example of his pairings. We have here a Canadian goose, which is a winter migrant, paired with Lobelia bahamensis, the only endemic plant that Catesby had included within his work. No description of this species in terms of the text, and this was likely included because of its potential in the horticultural trade. Of note, he has no description or discussion of Bahamian pine. This is a very prevalent species on 3 of the 4 islands he visited. And it seems incredulous that he would not have seen this species. But as we look at it, we say, well, what do we know about Bahamian pine? This is an endemic subspecies that we have. We know from the fossil pollen record that when the Lucayans arrived, the original inhabitants, that they introduced fire. And Bahamian pine is a fire-dependent species. Within that, you could see the spread of this species throughout the islands in that record. Well, in 1492, Columbus arrived. By about 1820, all Lucayans were gone, completely extinct. And for about 150 years or so, there was no people there and no fire. And it's possible that these populations contracted in, and they were so far inland that we never got to them. We never saw them. But this is entirely speculation. So, in Catesby's work, he pairs these organisms, talk about them as a food source or how they were interacting ecologically. But within his works, there's a ton of what I would call mispairings, where you're like, why were these two put together? And this is a good example. So this is Rhizophora mangle, a red mangrove. Talks about it being in the Bahamas, but it's paired with what we know is an American alligator, which does not occur in the Bahamas. And we see this sort of over and over again, species that had no relationship. Why was it included? Potentially he was seeing a crocodile that are known to occur in the Bahamas, but only from fossil records, but largely we just don't know. Another example is a Cuban parrot paired with Colubrina elliptica. Colubrina elliptica is a species that occurs in the Caribbean and occurs in Cuba, but Catesby was never in Cuba, and he didn't observe this bird while he was in Cuba. This bird is one that he was able to observe while he was in the Carolinas because it said it was given to a gentlewoman from the Carolinas from the governor of Havana. He was able to observe it there, but then paired it with a Bahamian species. Here's another one, Cronilluteria, named after the island of Luther, where it was first discovered, paired with this plain-bellied water snake. Plain-bellied water snakes occur in the Carolinas, have no anywhere in the Bahamas. He has a lot of discussion of the Cronilluteria because at the time he describes how it's not a species that's easy to find anymore. All the big trees were gone by the time he arrived. And it was of note because this was a valuable species all the way back to 1725. And people would collect the wood, bark, and they would infuse it into water and wine. And in fact, it is still used this way today. The liquor company Campari comes to the Bahamas every year, and people go out and extract Cronilluteria bark and sell it to Campari. Campari uses that plant product to flavor Campari liquor. Another strange pairing is a terrestrial plant with a marine species. Here we have Phyllanthus epiphylanthus, all very common in the Bahamas, but paired with a remora, a suckerfish on sharks and things like that. Why were these two put together on a plate? Maybe they had a similar shape, maybe. Hard to say. Within his discussion, but not in a plate, are 4 palm species. And he brings them up because they were of such high importance, and he regrets having not illustrated them in it, because they were such use. Each one of them he describes in the products and the use of it. And he spends the most time talking about sable palm, which we think of Sabal palmetto. It talks about how useful it was for the flat work, to get buttons, to use it to make their housing and things like that. And we know it's Sabal palmetto because he describes it as a species that occurs as far north as the Carolinas. And so from that description, we know that's the only species that would have that wide a distribution. So I could talk about these plates all day long, but I'm just going to introduce a few of them very quickly to talk about interesting stories. So Catesby spinosa, this was named after Mark Catesby. He did not name it after himself. It was named by the Dutch botanist J.F. Gronovius, who really said, hey, you should include this one. And it's, in fact, it's the last plate, second volume. Did he collect this and describe this because it had any value in terms of wood? You can't really use it. They don't become big trees. The fruits are not edible, and very much was included because of its horticultural value, which you can see here has these beautiful pendulant flowers, one of our only large showy flowers. He brought this back to Europe, describes it being grown in hothouses there, but says that only a Mr. Powers, the gentleman who was able to get it to fully flowering fruit in his space. Others of note are Squitinia mahogani, a mahogany that occurs there. And he brings it up because they were of such girth that we've seen trees that were up to 1.5 meters in diameter. But he also describes it as great wood for boat building because it's really good at taking shot. Certainly a reference to the pirates and others that they were battling. You wanted to build your boat with mahogany. You could really take a cannonball. We do not have mahoganies in the Bahamas anymore of that size. They were all extracted out. It's still a fairly common species, but for me, the largest one I've seen in the entire country now is about 0.5 meter in diameter. I gotta talk about this. This is manchineel. This is like, what were you thinking, Mark? This manchineel is an extremely toxic species. And it is well known from its toxicity all the way back to the second voyage of Christopher Columbus, where it's talked about how poisonous it was. He describes in the text on how wonderful and fine-grained the wood was. And he talks about having gotten sap in his eye. He went blind for days. He was swollen and covered in a rash. And he's quite lucky that he didn't die. Manchineel is long known for its toxicity. It was used as a tool of assassination when the indigenous people were fighting the conquistadors. It still kills people today that pick up the fruits and eat them. As it's known in Spanish, I would say, I'm going to mess this up, but manzanilla de la muerte, the little apple of death. Others of note to talk about is Metopium toxiferum, also a quite toxic species that apparently he did not have such close encounters with, luckily. This was known for its toxicity and its ability to do a rash, but not one that he really talked about. I want to step back and mention a little bit more of Manchineel. He has some very interesting observations. So Manchineel at the time was talked about as one of the causes of fish poisoning. People would eat barracuda and get sick, and this is still something that happens today. The reason that it wasn't possible for what people were saying is that the fish would eat the apples that fell in the water, and then they would gain the toxicity. And he's like, no, that can't possibly be true because the iguanas also eat them, and we eat iguanas, and nothing happens to us. And there's nowhere near enough trees that are near the ocean for all of these apples to get in and poison all of the barracuda. Another of note is Brasilida Cincinnati bahamensis, another highly sought after species. And by the time it arrived in 1725, that was largely cut out of the island of New Providence. This is of importance because it was of economic value in that you could extract a red dye out of it. And that was highly valuable. And in fact, the first permanent settlement in the Bahamas in 1648 was created when a group of Lutheran adventurers out of Bermuda sailed south and shipwrecked on the island of Eleuthera, sent word back to the colonies for assistance. Massachusetts sent down help, and they repaid it by filling the boat up with Brasilida wood, which was then sent back to Massachusetts and sold off. And in fact, the first wood that was sent back in 1648 was sold off in Massachusetts, and those proceeds were used to then buy the first building that became Harvard University. I want to end by talking about this particular plate. This shows Bavaria succulenta, which talked about as people use to drink the juice from, and that it would increase your appetite and good for your stomach. And Bahamians still today will use this one in their bush teas for those exact reasons. But the reason I bring it up is we paired it with this Bahamian putia, the only native land mammal in the Bahamas. And it's of note, especially for conservation today. This is now a critically endangered species, a very highly reduced distribution in the southern islands that he didn't get to. But he describes it at the time as being looking a little like a rabbit, but tasting a lot like a pig. And it's like, okay, it was obviously common enough at the day that people were hunting it, that we saw them, things like this, and it provides valuable insight to us in terms of conservation and how we might reintroduce these species onto other islands based on his work from then. So I want to end by saying thank you for listening and learning about Mark Catesby. I have digital copies of Mark Catesby's work, and I'm going to have them put up on, and if you guys can all access them and have them as part of your collection. You could buy an original Mark Catesby, but there's only about 100 of them left globally. They're quite rare books. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ethan. That was perfect timing.
Right on time. We have plenty of time for questions, and I think you'll be happy to answer them.
I really encourage you to get to know them. It is a really incredible insight into a world of 300 years ago and documenting what was going on. And there are just some beautiful, beautiful drawings. Yes.
Thanks, Ethan. Great presentation. I share your views in terms of some of the comments that you talked about Catesby making about his insights that we're now interpreting in terms of conservation. Do you think that because the tack was all around uses and importance for things for man, that's why we've lost the conservation message from that? And we're having to reinvent it now, because it feels like a lot of the time we're reinventing it. We're actually, we can look back on these people. They knew at the time what was happening. But is it a mindset, do you think? Or is it just something with the way that we've evolved as communities?
I think it's a mindset, but it's also just the relative disconnect that people have from nature. That you don't grow your own food, you don't harvest, and you're not going fishing. So if you know your food and your medicines from a pharmacy and a supermarket, you're not thinking about where they came from and uses like that. So I think it is that evolution of that mindset.
Thank you, Ethan. This was an incredibly fascinating presentation and historical piece. I really resonate to this. question for you is, maybe you mentioned it earlier, but in terms of access to Catesby's actual works, how did that come about? Did you have access to that? Did you have to go hunting? How did that work?
The reason I got involved with it is just because we're at this real historical moment in that he arrived in the Carolinas in 1722. We just had the 300th anniversary, and there's a Mark Catesby Society in the Carolinas, and they wanted to do sort of a symposium on Mark Catesby. And because there's so much discussion of the Bahamas, they had contacted me and asked me if I could work on some of it, and that's what I started doing, this deeper dive into it. And they provided me with the digital copies that were scanned of the original.
Thank you, Ethan. Thank you very much.
You gotta stay in.